But where are you really from?
A podcast about the Asian American struggle.
Hi, I'm Jesse Lynn.
And I'm Angela Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
This week, we're going to get a little intimate with you listeners, and we're going to have the talk. If you guys remember the talk, you know that it's related to sex and intimacy. So we wanted to dive right into this. Did you, Angela, get the talk from your parents?
Absolutely not. There's no way that they know what the talk is or dared to talk about it. No, the best that my mom ever did was when I was dating someone and I told her that he had stayed over, but he just literally, we just slept. There was nothing happened, but I was like, don't worry, nothing happened. Literally, we just slept. And she was like, oh, but you could get pregnant. I'm like, do you know how pregnancy works? I just told you that we just slept. And she's like, yeah, but you're next. Anyway, so that indicated to me that even her understanding of sex and how pregnancy works is maybe not that crisp. So certainly she was never trying to teach me that herself.
Wow.
How about you?
I don't think my parents had the birds and the bees talk with me either because, well, I think there are a couple reasons, but one of the first reasons is probably that we learned about it in school and I had to get a consent form signed by my parents. So I had to explain to them, we're getting this course and it's gonna walk me through sex and stuff. But no, they never really had really a conversation about it. Okay, so I think my mom caught me watching porn one time. But this was in the the dial-up days. So it was it took so long to load that I'm not even sure she saw anything. But literally the next day my dad had this conversation with me on the car being you should stay away from things that are sexual in nature. And I was like, okay, this is kind of I didn't connect those things. So I was like, this is kind of coming a little left field and weird. And also, how do you know I know what's sexual in nature if you never talk to me about sex? Looking back on it, I'm kind of what did that even mean for him?
Yeah.
Is a pinup girl sexual in nature? Right. Or is full nudity? Or what is that? So definitely no, we did not get the talk from the parents.
I don't know.
Hey everyone, we love doing this podcast, and if you enjoy our episodes, we would really appreciate if you could support us in any number of ways. First is by subscribing to us, rating us, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. Second is by telling a friend. Third is following us on Instagram at whereareyoufrompod. Fourth is by buying our merch on our website. And fifth is supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee. You can find out more about all of these by visiting our Instagram's link in bio. And again, our handle is at whereareyoufrompod. Thank you.
I think there were many reasons why I looked at sex as taboo growing up. Mm-hmm. And there's many Asian cultural upbringing elements to it, family upbringing elements to it. But I also think being surrounded by a lot of, a big Christian community and knowing that everyone was waiting till marriage for sex and stuff like that, that definitely also played into my concept of when it's appropriate to have sex for the first time and beyond.
Honestly, I think that kind of made it worse because then you didn't really get information from trusted sources. Mm-hmm. So people would make stuff up about parts and sex and stuff, other stuff about other myths. I kind of remember I remember there was one where it was all girls have hymens and the hymen is everybody has it and it's this thing you pop when you have sex with a girl for the first time. And I'm I don't think that's real.
Wait.
What's happening here?
Hold on.
What's happening here?
I don't think the myth is that every woman has a hymen. I think that is true that every woman has a hymen, but I think the myth is that the only way to break the hymen is through sex.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
That's
so
what I meant.
everyone
Sorry.
has a hymen.
Yes, I misspoke.
Okay, I was like, what?
Everyone has one, but like the idea was that like it's somehow this like everyone has it the same way, where it's like this barrier that gets popped the first time you have sex, and that's like not a real thing.
Yeah, that's definitely a myth because, and I don't remember where they like debunked that myth. It might have been during sex ed or I don't know, but there are like many ways you can break your hymen before. Like, I distinctly remember the easiest one to remember was like horseback riding. Something where it's like, it's like
Slut.
your vagina is hitting something hard that is not a penis and it can break. And yeah, no, but I remember that for sure because the like stigma that's attached to a torn hymen, right, is like, oh my God, then you're not a virgin, you're a slut. Yeah. So that was definitely one. Let's get into many of the factors that kind of like shaped our perception of sex, and we loosely touched on it before, but in general, I do feel like in Asian culture, at least the way families raise their kids, it's pretty taboo to talk about sex. Like, I think it's fairly common that most Asian kids did not grow up ever having the talk with their parents because that's just not a subject that they want to have. Why do you think that is?
So I'm not super sure. I kind of feel like I feel like there might be some like historical roots of it because I just remember like a few fables or tales from the past where you have like Chinese emperors or like court officials who were like met their downfall because they were like lustful and they tied that to to sin, and like they lost control of their lives pursuing this lust. So I think there's definitely some like cultural historical backing around sex, specifically sex for pleasure rather than sex for procreation, because I kind of feel like I've never heard a story where it's like, oh, they procreated, like they had sex for a baby and that was bad. It's usually like they had sex with multiple people and it was fun, and that's bad. So then you really only do sex for procreation.
Yeah.
And let's face it, like if you're just doing sex to have babies, you're not going to be doing sex enough to know exactly what you want. So it's just going to be a not fun experience overall, which probably means you didn't have a lot of sex. So then you probably didn't have a lot of experience to pass down like what to do during sex, because it's really just the procreation part of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I feel like there's so much to unpack in what you just said. But for sure, one thing I agree with is that the way Asian people look at sex is that it has one main purpose, and that is to pass down the family lineage by having children. So that's your main reason why you should be having sex. I also think another part of what you said is very true, which is like, when you go back into fables and stuff, but like continued on into modern times, it's they do talk about this like lustfulness in a bad way, and it's always the woman that's like enticing the man, like seducing the man and like bringing him vice and sin and like his downfall, right? And I think that ties a lot into the gender specific roles that Asian people, especially older generations, place on the respective genders. And it's like, okay, well, men are like more prone to having these sexual feelings. It's still bad for them to act on them, but it's not their fault because it's the women that are like corrupting them. And because of that kind of feeling, it's also kind of implied that like women don't ever have the right to want to seek pleasure for themselves, because they're always kind of this like secondary object kind of to men. They're like the supporting role. There's not like the woman first and then the man seduced her kind of thing. Like it's always one way. And like that's definitely how I was raised in terms of thinking like, it's bad for you to think about sex, and like you shouldn't have sex. It's like the only time you should have sex is after you're already married and you're ready to have kids, because that's the only like acceptable format for a woman to be having sex. Otherwise you're like a loose girl and you're gonna disgrace us, and you know, they're just all these like underlying things, because as a woman you're not allowed to have those desires and to act on them. I also think there's a second narrative that is spun a lot, which is that women are supposed to be this like very innocent, pure type of character, and the only time sex comes into play is when there's like a predatory kind of like man that's trying to impose their sexual will. And like, how is that supposed to make me feel as like a young, you know, like a 12 or 13-year-old? I'm like, oh, okay,
gross.
so men are always trying to like rape me, essentially. Like that's like the narrative is, oh, you never have those feelings, you're just this like innocent little thing that's just like living your life, and then suddenly men are gonna like appear and want this out of you and like force it on you.
I think it's also bad in a sense because it kind of implies that your only value to a man is that.
Yeah.
And something else interesting you brought up, and part of the reason why I feel like women who have sex are painted in such a bad light is because they're the foil to the innocent woman, right? The woman who has sex is smart. Bitch, if I only had a body in the 1800s and I could fuck my way to the top, you bet I would. Like, you know what I mean? Like, she's smart. And so I think that they also paint that lady in a bad light, that kind of woman in a bad light, because you're supposed to be innocent and you're supposed to be dainty and helpless and blah blah blah.
Yeah, and be saved by the man because you can't do it for yourself. Yeah, very interesting. I also feel like I grew up in a very like weird way where, again, like we never talked about sex really, but it was like implied it exists, right? And like it would come up in like weird ways. So my family, I think we talked about this, but we always went to Vegas every year for Christmas for like the first 20 years of my life. And you know, Vegas, it's dirty and just like grimy, but there are always like people on the streets, like, you know, they're trying to like give you playing cards of like nude women, and then there are like ladies that are standing outside their strip clubs or whatever who are scantily clad and like trying to get men in. And I remember one time I was like, Dad, you're so gross. We walked by, like we were as a family walking down somewhere in Vegas, and we passed by some stripper essentially in front of her establishment, and she was just like, oh, you know, like trying to get people to come in, and we passed by, and my dad made a joke, and he was like, oh, you guys will wait for me, right? I'll just head on in. And I was like, Dad, you're fucking disgusting. And I was just like, but the fact that he felt like it was okay to make that kind of joke in front of his family gave me the impression that within this like Asian type of upbringing, besides not speaking about sex ever, the other weird element is that like it's implied that everyone knows that men are always like thinking about sex and like trying to have sex and like watching porn and like doing all these things, and like it's frowned upon, but it's like okay.
Boys will be boys kind of situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was so disturbing for me for so many reasons, but I was just like, fuck that. That's not okay.
What do you think are the consequences of not learning about sex outside of like the anatomy of sex and like the mechanics of procreation?
So many consequences. I don't know for you, but for me, it like, I think fucked me up is a very dramatic way to talk about it, but I do think it stunted my growth in a lot of ways, because we've talked about in our relationships, right? Like romantic side, that taking sex out of the equation, just like having a serious relationship with someone else, we felt stunted from not learning a lot about like communicating emotions from our families, right? And similarly, sex goes along with that as well. And because both of you and I didn't start dating until later in our lives. Similarly, I didn't have sex for the first time until later in my life. So I always felt weird. Like, I felt really weird. I think because the media also always portrays like you're supposed to lose your virginity in high school or something, like it's always like, oh, when you're like super young is when that's normal. So then I kind of felt like every year I got older and I didn't have sex yet, I was like super weird, and it was like grating on me, because I think when I was younger I used to tell myself like, oh, it's fine, because I sold myself that like abstinence story where it was like, oh, you should only have sex if you're like in love. Well, first it was like if you're married, which is like so extreme, right? And then I got older and I like dialed it back from to married to in love with. I'm like, I mean, that's a bare minimum, right? Like you don't want to give away this like the goods to someone you're not even in love with. So I always held on to this like very like idealistic fairy tale, like I'm gonna be in love with the person I have sex with for the first time. And then the reality is life doesn't work that way, and like I wasn't in a relationship where I felt that closely with someone for a long, for many years of my life. And so I had to like eventually learn that it's okay to not have these like super strict confines around when it's appropriate or not to lose my virginity. And then past that point, like the frequency with which I'm allowed to have sex and things like that. These all came later to me in life than I think like the majority, quote unquote, of people, based on how the media portrayed like when was appropriate for that kind of milestone to have happened. And because of that, everything else just like snowballs from there, right? Like because I started late, then there are like other consequences to that. So I do think it had a big impact on my like sexual growth and knowledge around myself. You?
I agree, but in a different way. Again, our paths diverge. So I think because I was really curious about sex, and I was also trying to find like myself, because I was just coming to terms with the fact that I only liked men and not women. I did start having sex in high school. But the problem for me with it, I think, is that I equated sex with love and intimacy. And so it became kind of like a really bad drug for me, because like I would sleep with somebody and then, be into them, want to hang out with them, or try to develop at least some kind of like relationship with them. And, now I understand, I have a better picture, like it's a better picture that like you can just sleep with someone and that's cool, and like one time and that's fine. But at the time I was like still in high school, right? So like having that happen where you like sleep with someone, then they're like not interested in you at all. Like I didn't understand that. And so like that was just like a negative feedback loop where I was like, okay, now I need to find more. Then it was like more rejection. So it was like kind of like that, where I had the experience where, because I didn't have authoritative figures in my life explaining to me that these things were different, that like sex and love are not the same thing, I internalized that from the media, from seeing these depictions of people having sex and always being in love. And kind of, it just became kind of like a bad thing for me. Fun but bad thing for me. So I had a different kind of experience there, because I internalized it a different way.
Interesting. I learned something new about you every day, even though I've known you my whole life. Secrets.
A woman's heart is an ocean of secrets. Titanic.
Lols. Okay, well, so we already kind of hinted at it, but it seems like both you and I learned the majority of what we knew about sex through the media, but that's not life, right? So like where did you start learning the real shit about what it takes to not just have sex, like mechanics and whatever, but like to build real intimacy with a partner and things like that?
Yeah, well, the sex part of it was just mainly trial by fire. I mean, once you have enough sex with people, you're kind of like, okay, I know how to do these specific things. The intimacy thing, honestly, it came like a lot later in life because like I just never had someone stop me and be like, "What are you doing?" Like sex and love are not the same things, and so I didn't understand that until like a lot later. I feel like I didn't really get that until like I left or was like in the middle of college when I started to be like, "Oh, okay, I don't have to sleep with like everybody I meet for them to like me." And like I can, be friends with people without sleeping with them. So and then like once I was able to get into a relationship that wasn't just all about like physical intimacy, then I understood kind of what the difference was and what kind of work it takes to develop a physical relationship with someone and what kind of work it takes to develop a like emotional relationship with someone. And then it's kind of the same way with sex. It's like practice. Like you go through the motions, trial by fire. You see people break up with people, crush on people, all that stuff, and that gives you more experience until you feel comfortable enough with your own process of developing a relationship and you know what you want in a partner. What about you?
Yeah, definitely a lot of trial and error, like you're saying. Honestly, it was very clunky learning all these things, like actual sex, very clunky. It was like a lot of Googling and like me kind of like scaring myself with what I was finding on Google and
Oh my
like
God.
hyping shit too much. And it was also because a lot of my friends are still the like more goody two shoey or
Yeah.
up until that point.
Yeah, yeah.
So there was no one where I felt comfortable being like, hey, here's the reality. I've never had sex. I just need someone to like tell me what to expect. There was no one like that I could really like turn to. So it was just like shameful, like secret Googling for a lot of it. Until, things actually happened. And then that whole time was just like, is this what sex is? Like, I was just like so confused the whole time. I'm like, I don't get why people like this. It was, because the media, right, like paints your
Yeah,
first
yeah.
time as this like such a magical and like easy moment that like you'll just get it and like everything will just like happen. And the reality is that's not what most people's first times are like. And mine
No.
was certainly not like that. And I was just like, I don't even get this. Like, why? And then the intimacy part is, I also struggled with that quite a bit because I think similarly with you, I think I did try to equate sex and love together, especially because I had this like weird thinking that like you can only have sex if you are in love with someone, right? Which just that's just not the reality of like why a lot of people have sex. And so even though I was like, if anything, I kind of feel like because I wouldn't have sex with people until after a certain point, I was like hornier than most people because I was like bottling myself up because I wouldn't let myself get past a certain point.
Oh
So
my gosh.
yeah, so I always had this like, lustful desire, but then I knew that that was like one part of it, right? Like lust is one thing, love is another thing. Theoretically, I knew that, but I definitely was just like you, where it was like, okay, I'd have this like intimate, time with someone, and then I'd be like glued to my phone being like, when are they going to text me, and like when
Yeah,
are we moving
call
into
me.
like the next
Yeah.
stage, and it's just like a lot of rejections of people being like, that's not what this was, for me to realize like, oh yeah, that's not what this was, and that's not
Yeah.
what it needs to be for anyone moving forward. And I think the intimacy piece comes with knowing that intimacy doesn't even have to have anything to do with sex. Like, you can feel really intimate with someone by the connection that you have with them emotionally, by, the values and perspectives that you share, and like feeling it's the heart part of it, right? I feel like that's the
Yeah.
difference. It's like sex is the
Yeah.
like literal mechanics and the, physical part of it, and intimacy is the emotional connection part of it. So I think once I started having relationships with people where I felt that connection emotionally, then I realized like, okay, these are two different things, but also they play into each other, right? So
Yes.
it was definitely trial and error, Googling, lots of mistakes, and then like a very slow growth into the right direction. I feel like sex is one of those things that like you're never gonna know everything about, honestly. And something that I'm still working on myself is like knowing what makes me happy. Because they're like I think that's something I denied myself a lot growing up because of this constant feedback of like sex is bad, wait to have sex, like don't have sex. So I was constantly telling myself that, and then I would feel guilty, you know, when I'd have those desires, and so I didn't explore my body and like what made me excited or things like that when I was growing up, and I'm like catching up now. So actually for women out there who are also kind of like still on this self-discovery journey for yourself, there's this really cool platform that I found a few years back, and it's called OMG Yes. And it's a women-made platform where they like interviewed thousands of women about what turns them on and like what specific techniques and things like that are like pleasurable for them. And it's kind of funny because it sounds like porn, but it's not really porn because it's educational, but there are like literal tutorial videos of like women, real women. So it's not like porn stars or just like perfect body people. It's like women all ages and body types, and they explain like different techniques that they use on themselves or a partner helps them with, and that like really works for them. So would recommend, and we're not sponsored by them, so you know this is legit. But yeah, that's been a really cool platform because I feel like there's a very lacking education around like women pleasuring themselves and how that happens, because porn is largely geared towards men, right? And there's like very little female oriented porn, but even so porn is not educational. So there's just like they realized there was this gap and they filled it, and I'm like very happy that they did, because I always felt super weird not knowing what could work for me. And then I'm like, oh, there are thousands of women that helped build this platform. That must mean I'm not weird because other people need this too.
Well, I think we talked a lot about sex and intimacy. You guys probably know way too much about us. So we're going to move on to our fortune cookie closing segment, because we always like to end the episode with something sweet. So we wanted to give each other and you guys our best advice about sex and intimacy. Angela?
Yeah, mine is already tied to what I was saying before about this platform, but largely speaking, I feel like a big piece of advice is just getting to know your body more yourself, like without a partner, because there's a lot you can learn about like what turns you on, what feels good, what like angles work, you know, a lot you can do on your own. And then once you learn those things about yourself, it's about communication, because I feel like much like with everything else in our relationships, communication is so key, because I think a lot of times you just assume that the other person will kind of like get it or like know what works for you, and you're just like waiting for something to happen that is not happening. Versus if you just tell them outright, like, okay, move this way, or like try this, or actually don't do that, I don't like that. And like that's how you actually learn what's going to work when there's two people, right? And two or more people involved. So I would highly recommend learning about your own body first, or having that little exploration, and then communicating what you've learned to your partner.
I think that's great advice. Thank you for sharing that. Definitely very much what you said, but I will add like, know what you want and stick to it. And I'm not just talking about like knowing your own like what makes you pleased in sex, but also like how comfortable you are doing something and how far you want to go with someone, and all that stuff. Like that's your power, and you should never give that away to anyone. So if you're in a situation and you're like, hey, I don't like this, leave.
Yeah.
If someone else is in the same situation, they're like, I don't like this, let them go. Like everyone should be free to make their own choices about it, and know yourself and enforce what makes you feel comfortable, because that's what makes sex fun.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Very good PSA for everyone. Well, yeah, like you said, now we know you know too much about us. And so it's your turn. We'd like you to write us in on anything that you want to share around this topic, whether it was the way that your upbringing kind of affected your outlook on sex and intimacy, or if you have advice that you want to share with other people, or whatever it is. I think there's a lot of fun and interesting stuff around this topic. So write us in at telluswhereyou'refrom@gmail.com. The your is YOURE.
Send us naughty stories, but not too naughty.
Maybe like PG-13 naughty. Up to R rated is what we would like to receive.
This is the last episode of this season, and as with last season, we're taking a breaky break to rejuvenate our brains.
Yes.
So we will see all of you lovely listeners in
A month or two, something like that.
a month or two. Yeah.
Whatever, we'll announce it, you'll know,
Yeah.
but we'll be back. Don't worry. We'll come back with another season of fresh new content, new guests, a lot of cool fun stuff, but like Jessie said, we need a break so that we can come back and give you the good stuff.
All right. Well, until next season,
再见, bitches.